This is a summative review of Unit 6, Reconstruction, Essential Information. Reconstruction was the period directly following the Civil War, which ended in 1865, and Reconstruction ended in the Compromise of 1877. It focused on the social, political, and economic rebuilding of the nation. In Lincoln's view, President at the end of the Civil War, the United States was one nation, indivisible. He believed that secession was illegal and that Confederate governments in the southern states were illegitimate and that the states had never really left the Union. Because of this belief, he thought that Reconstruction was a matter of quickly restoring legitimate state governments that were loyal to the Union in the southern states. He believed that once the war was over, to reunify the nation, the federal government should not punish the South, but act with, quote, malice towards none and charity for all to bind up the nation's wounds, end quote. The assassination of Lincoln, however, by John Wilkes Booth, just a few days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, enabled radical Republicans to influence the process of Reconstruction in a manner more punitive or punishing towards the former Confederate states. The radical Republicans in Congress believed in a more punitive, punishing Reconstruction. The states that seceded from the Union were not allowed back into the Union immediately, but were instead put under military occupation, as demonstrated in the map below. The radical Republicans believed in aggressively guaranteeing voting and other civil rights to African Americans. They were largely responsible for passage of the three so-called Civil War amendments to the U.S. Constitution. First, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. This was the only amendment passed during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment, states were prohibited from denying equal rights under the law to any American citizen, whereby providing citizenship to former slaves. And finally, the 15th Amendment was for voting rights. Voting rights were guaranteed regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That last part, previous condition of servitude, referring to former slaves. The radical Republicans, however, clashed repeatedly with Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, over the issue of civil rights for freedmen. And they eventually impeached him, but they failed to remove him from office. What were the post-war contributions of Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Frederick Douglass? Ulysses S. Grant urged radical Republicans not to be harsh with former Confederates, illustrating a conciliatory feeling much like had been there at the end of the war. After Johnson's presidency, Grant was elected to president and served during most of Reconstruction. He advocated for the rights of freedmen and opposed retribution or punishment directed towards the defeated South. Robert E. Lee also urged Southerners to reconcile and rejoin the United States. He served as president of Washington College, which today bears the name Washington and Lee University. He emphasized the importance of education to the nation's future, and today he's buried at the so-called Lee Chapel at Washington and Lee. And finally, Frederick Douglass supported full equality for African Americans and was a leading spokesman for African Americans in the nation following the Civil War. He advocated for the passage of the 14th and the 15th Amendments. He encouraged the federal government to take action to protect the rights of freedmen in the South. And he served as an ambassador to Haiti and in the civil service. The Reconstruction period ended following the extremely close presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate. This is illustrated in the electoral map, and the fraudulent election returns, many of them based on violence, is demonstrated in the electoral cartoon. The political cartoon showing children or blood as the Democrats tried to seize power back in the South through violence. In return for support in the Electoral College vote from Southern Democrats, the Republicans agreed to end the military occupation of the South. This deal was known as the Compromise of 1877, and it effectively enabled former Confederates who controlled the Democratic Party to regain power. As is demonstrated in this political cartoon, where you see the KKK, the White League, these were considered the foot soldiers, the terrorist groups formed to regain political, social, and economic power in the South and put slaves through intimidation and violence, former slaves back in a status of slavery again. To summarize, the Civil War and Reconstruction resulted in Southern resentment towards the North and Southern African Americans. Ultimately, it led to the political, economic, and social control of the white South. While Reconstruction introduced a measure of civil rights, the economic and political gains of former slaves were only temporary. It opened the door to the so-called Jim Crow era and began a long period in which African Americans in the South were denied the full rights of American citizenship. Discrimination and segregation against African Americans intensified and took new forms in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Many Southern state governments passed Jim Crow laws forcing separation of the races in public places where they feared racial mixing. Intimidation and crimes were directed against African Americans, such as in lynchings or hangings of black men, in order to enforce racial segregation. These pictures show some of the segregation laws in theaters, water fountains, all public places, including schools, that you see in the lower right. African Americans looked to the courts to safeguard their rights, but in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment. Therefore, it upheld the Jim Crow laws of the era. African Americans disagreed about how to respond to these developments. During the 20th century, African Americans began the so-called Great Migration to northern cities in search of jobs and to escape poverty and discrimination in the South. This is a map showing some of the directions to northern cities that African Americans took. Others, such as Ida B. Wells, led anti-lynching crusades to call upon the federal government to do more to take action against the violence. Booker T. Washington believed the way to equality was through vocational education or skills training, such as at Tuskegee Institution, which he founded. And he also wanted African Americans to gain jobs through this vocational education and achieve economic success. In the short term, he accepted social separation in order to achieve these economic successes. In contrast, W.E.B. Du Bois believed that education was meaningless without equality. He supported political equality for African Americans by helping to form the NAACP, or the NAACP. This is the National Association for Advancement of Colored People that would work through the courts to fight for the immediate equality of African Americans. The NAACP would eventually be responsible for helping to push the court and the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, in which the Supreme Court, after nearly a century of segregation, would agree in the area of schools that separate but equal did not apply. So therefore, Brown versus Board of Education would overturn the Plessy discussion that we had earlier. We'll talk more about the modern civil rights movement when we get to the 20th century. Please review these slides and your notes on Reconstruction.